What's going on, folks? Ted from Nerd Immersion here, and I'm making a speculative video now, one that I wasn't anticipating making, but I think this could be very insightful and useful for what the future of Dungeons & Dragons is going to look like. So, first of all, if you're unfamiliar with Sly Flourish and anything Lazy Dungeon Master's Guide or any of that stuff that Mike puts out there, what Dungeons & Dragons rock have you been living under? Please go to slyflourish.com, check out all of Mike's work, head over to pick up a copy of the Lazy Dungeon Master's Guide. Some of that's even available on audiobook, believe it or not. But I wanted to talk to you because about 3 hours ago, as of the time of me recording this, Mike put out this tweet that says, at Wininger R, which is Ray Wininger, the head of Dungeons & Dragons, presented to you with humility, and it's called What I'd Love from the Next Iteration of Dungeons & Dragons. I've done several videos like this in the past, but we're going to go through what Mike says specifically because Ray here responds, retweets that tweet, and says, I think you're going to be pleased. Now, I may be making a mountain out of a molehill here, sure. However, he presented it to Ray. Ray went out of his way to respond and say, I think you'll be pleased. Which leads me to believe that at least a portion of what Mike put in this article is going to come true. And depending on what it is, it's all good news for us as 5e players. If all of it comes through, even better. So let's go ahead and check out Mike's article here. So what I love from the next iteration of D&D. It says, I love D&D. People have complaints, sure, and it's for my love of the game that I offer these desires for the next iteration of D&D. I recognize my own desires come from just one of millions of people playing the game, but I offer my requests nonetheless. Make 5.5e fully 5e compatible. I want the next iteration to be as fully compatible with 5th edition as it can. There are millions of 5th edition books in the world, more than any other version of D&D. That's including Mike's own stuff, the DM's Guild, all of the wonderful third-party creators out there, 2C Gaming, Jetpack 7, Cobalt Press, Ghostfire Gaming, MCDM. There's thousands of companies out there with millions of books available, right? What an incredible waste it would be for those books to be obsolete. 100% agree. I want Monsters of the Multiverse to work with the new version of D&D. I want Tasha's Cauldron of Everything to work with it. I want Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel to work with it. Keep 5.5e backwards compatible. When an adventure calls for a veteran, I want a compatible veteran coming out of the new monster manual and know it still works just fine. Now, to this point, we have, and I've said this and I'm wary about it myself, we have heard that 5.5 is supposed to, whatever 5.5, 6, whatever you want to call it, is supposed to be, quote, backwards compatible with 5th edition. We have no concept of what that means, right? Technically, 3.5e and 3rd edition were backwards compatible, yes, and with a little bit of, but it wasn't a seamless transition. I mean, hell, they even released a guide, I think it might have even, I don't know if it was for free, but there was definitely a guide that they released at the end of 2nd edition before 3rd edition started that WotC put out, of a 2nd edition to 3rd edition conversion guide. Like, they made that as a product because they wanted, it was easier to convert 2nd edition to 3rd edition, and they never did anything for 4th because that was just so different. And honestly, as someone who's taken a lot of stuff from 3rd edition and put it into 5th, with very minimal tweaks and adjustments, that's also an easy thing to do. But it's hard to say, right? We don't really know what this next iteration is going to look like. We might find out in 3 days' time on the 18th. However, we'll have to see, but I agree with Mike here completely. It should be as backwards as compatible as possible. Obviously, there's going to be things where it won't be. Obviously, like I said, my biggest thing that I can guarantee is whatever we have in the player's handbook currently, the reason we're not seeing updates to the tiefling, the base elves, dwarves, and so on to mimic what we see in things like Monsters of the Multiverse, or the way the terminology about feats or backgrounds or all these things happen, is because they're saving that for the print version that comes out in 2024. And I think that will be a small tweak, but a big tweak, a small tweak in the grander scheme of things. But I don't know. I agree. Make it fully compatible. Include easier encounter building. Encounter building in the current 5th edition DMG is both complex and inaccurate. 100% agree. The two-table system of experience point values and multipliers for the number of monsters creates a constantly tweaking system that doesn't provide an accurate measure of any easy, medium, hard, or deadly encounter when done, and it is simply too hard to do so. Xanathar's Guide to Everything includes a much improved chart-based system, but still one too complex to easily figure out, and one that doesn't provide a clear picture of combat difficulty. Better, faster, easier, and looser encounter building guidelines could help DMs quickly measure encounters built either before or during the game. Building a reasonably balanced encounter should be easy and fun. I 100% agree. This is one thing that I do feel like, unfortunately, falls into the DM Fiat veteran style area, because I don't personally look at the Dungeon Master's Guide, at least in 5th edition. I don't look at it, or Xanathar's Guide, when I'm building an encounter for my players, right? I just kind of have a gut feeling about knowing the party, what magic items I've given them, what the overall power level is, whether they had rolled stats or point by, all this kind of stuff. I have a general gut feeling about, like, this is going to be a good, challenging encounter, but not one that will kill them outright. Now, obviously, the dice can swing things one way or another, but I've always felt, especially with 5th edition, that is definitely a gut call that comes from a DM with experience kind of feeling that vibe out. And I think that is truly because the tools we have in 5th edition currently are kind of garbage. And Mike said that in a much nicer way, but that's how I feel as well. Oh, this next one. Include Theater of the Mind guidelines for combat. The DMG and Xanathar's Guide include pages of optional rules for gridded play and hardly any guideline for running games using Theater of the Mind or an abstract map for combat. Yet some of the most popular streaming game DMs, including games by Wizards of the Coast themselves, run combat with Theater of the Mind. While shared experiences among DMs in the community can help, clear guidance and suggestions in the core books would offer DMs a wider range of fun ways to run combat. I certainly don't see this as a replacement to gridded play, but instead an alternative option. A widening of the options to support lots of styles of play, including guidelines for both gridded combat and Theater of the Mind combat, further improves the accessibility of the game for both those with trouble visualizing combat in their heads, and those who, I guess that's aphantasia, I never heard that before. Well, I guess I got some research to do. And those who physically cannot see a battle map, sight blindedness, or sight limited or blindness. Yeah, so I'll agree. Back in older editions, like I tell you again, I can speak from 3rd edition because I have experience. There was a perforated, tear out grid in the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide because it was assumed that you would be playing on a gridded map. And like all of the different things in all of those books had information about gridded combat because it was basically assumed that that's just what you would do. Also, I'll say that back when those books were made, the concept of online gaming like we have now via Zoom or what have you was not really an option of any kind, really, except for maybe play-by-posts and forums. So it wasn't really an option where I'll tell you, I run Theater of the Mind a lot of the time. Now, I have a ton of minis and I have a ton of terrain, so I do like to try to utilize those whenever possible. But if I'm playing online with friends on and it's not like a super critical thing, a lot of the time I'll run Theater of the Mind when we play online because it's hard. Like, I don't want to detract and break the immersion of the game by having to draw a map and then people be like, where am I moving? Over here, over there. And again, especially for folks who do this stuff as podcasts, you don't want to hear people saying like, I'm going to move over here, because you can't visualize or see what over here means because you're not watching the stream or whatever it is. So again, and also in the past, I only ran gridded combat, and it wasn't until 5th edition that I got much more comfortable with Theater of the Mind as a concept. And I think I still use both, but to Mike's point, I think it might not even be a full guideline for Theater of the Mind, but maybe just as simple as like, here's the things you need your party to know, right? You need to know, if you're going to play Theater of the Mind, things to think about. Orientation, marching order, and distance, right? That's a simple thing. If you could draw that up on a map if you needed to, but like, hey, you're first, you're in the back, you're orientated to the north, the monsters are coming from the south, and they're X distance away, to just kind of give people a general concept. But to that point, right, some people have a very hard time visualizing it, and depending on how you word things, whether it's a pre-written module or something you just made up, and sometimes that movement and where things are situated spatially is critical for the terms of the combat, whether it be for AoE spells, movement speeds, teleportation, things of that nature. And then again, to the other side of that, right, there are folks that can't see battle maps because they're just incapable of seeing it for one reason or another. And being able to provide guidelines or benefits to help people get around that would be awesome. Strengthen high CR monsters. High CR monsters are often weak for their challenge rating when compared to lower CR monsters. I did a whole top 10 on like CR monsters that were CR 4 and less monsters that could absolutely decimate a party. They often don't do enough damage to threaten high-level characters. WotC's CR calculations overweight abilities high CR monsters require to challenge high-level characters. This ends up reducing their effective damage at their CR. A wolf at first level is significantly more dangerous than a Baylor at level 19. Recent attempts to increase the threat of higher CR monsters and monsters in the multiverse wasn't enough. While mid-CR monsters and monsters in the multiverse often increase their damage output, this just doesn't keep up at higher CRs. Make Baylors as deadly as wolves. 100% true, and I said this in a video I made recently. I feel like Wizards of the Coast heavily balanced the game around characters levels 1 to 10. So challenge ratings 0 to 10 monsters. Nothing higher than that. I don't know if they just didn't think games were going to get that high, didn't have the foresight back in 2014 when they released 5th edition, but I will tell you that I feel like both character classes from levels 10 plus, as well as monsters from CR 10 plus, all feel kind of either weak, underpowered, some things feel unfinished. Again, look at some of the subclass options, I would agree. All right, moving on, we have fix certain spells and abilities. Certain spells and abilities prove problematic in play. Spells like Force Cage circumvent a legendary monster's ability to hold its own against high level characters. Spells like Banish and Polymorph can instantly remove most non-legendary threats from the game with a single casting, resulting in the equivalent of hundreds of points of damage with a single cast. The poison immunity of Hero's Feast reduces the effective difficulty of a huge swath of monsters for everyone in a group for a whole day. Replace spells like Conjure Animals with the much improved summon spells like in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, so such spells don't give one player 9 turns in a round. Rebalance spells and abilities to ensure no single one changes how a DM needs to run the game. I can speak to that, right? Conjure Animals, again, I know technically per Conjure Animals, you don't get to pick what you conjure. I mean, that's kind of how the spell is written, but a lot of folks do let people pick what animal they're going to conjure. And honestly, the constrictors, giant constrictor snakes, summoning as many of those as you can, considering their attack, I think grapples and restrains, can basically just completely shred a combat by giving all of the enemies 0 movement, disadvantage on attack rolls, and more importantly, the party advantage on attack rolls, allowing the big heavy hitters to swing for crits. Interesting that there's no mention of Counterspell. So that's pretty cool. All right, include the Tasha's updates. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything includes many excellent quality of life changes, such as flexible attribute allocation, replacing abilities on level ups, and more. I guarantee those will be in it no matter what. If we're not, we're going to see more so of those baked into the base classes come 2024. Provide less problematic race descriptions. It wouldn't surprise me if one of the main reasons for a refresh of 5th edition is to cover problematic race descriptions like the racial essentialism of goblins and orcs in the Monster Manual. Other fans offer much better advice on this than I, and I support such changes for a wider, richer, and more interesting and more inclusive game. I'll take that a step further and say, one, I get it. I'm in full agreement. And 2, I'll take it a step further to say everything written in the Monster Manual, we saw this specifically with Volo's Guide to Monsters, was written very specifically from a Forgotten Realms standpoint. We saw that, right? Everything depicted in Volo's Guide to Monsters was Forgotten Realms centric, coming from Volo Gedentharp's position. I think whatever you're going to put into this future iteration should be essentially system agnostic, and I do feel like a lot of the descriptions that were written in there were colored in such a way to reflect the Forgotten Realms mythology, as opposed to just generic descriptions of all of those creatures. And it's actually more beneficial if you go generic kind of setting agnostic so that people can choose to alter and adjust them in whatever way they wish to fit their campaign. Update, oh, this is a huge one. Update the system resource document under the Open Gaming License. As a producer of 5th edition material, the Open Gaming License helps me publish material any DM can use to make their game better. While I can still publish content under the current 5th edition SRD, a new SRD would further connect the widespread community of 5th edition publishers to this new edition of D&D. The OGL and SRD helps bring D&D to the whole community, ensures it lasts the ages. Please update the SRD with the new changes and continue to support third-party publishers. This is the one I don't think is going to happen, unfortunately. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but the feeling that I have and sort of the rumblings and rumors that I've heard through the community is that this wouldn't be the case. And I get it, right? So, one, I want to say, first off, I'm against it. I think they should update the open game license, and they had an open game license in 3rd edition, and they had an open game license in 5th edition, and you know what edition didn't have it? 4th. And you know what was one of the biggest failures of an edition release? Would have been 4th. Yes, it was popular. Yes, it did okay, but it had a relatively quick turnaround into 5th edition. And I think the lack of an open gaming license and allowing third parties to produce their own content and sell it if they wanted to did help to lead to the decline of 4th edition. I mean, hell, the open game license in 3rd edition and the lack of the direction it took in 4th edition basically led to Pathfinder existing by starting off as a 3.5 edition open game license, spinning up into its whole own system. But I've said it before and I'll say it again, in the opposite side of it, as a business, some of the biggest losses potentially of money that Wizards of the Coast has every year would be to third-party publishers and the multiple multi-million-dollar Kickstarters for D&D related books. So if they say, well, you can use the updated open game license, but you have to publish it via the DMs Guild where we get 50% of all the profits, I get that from a business standpoint, but I also agree that it needs to be updated. This hasn't been touched in almost 6 years. There was a small update. They put out the SRD, or the Open Gaming License, and then very shortly after, they released an update, and that was it. The fact that you've made Artificer a base class in 5th edition now, as opposed to something that was going to be originally only for Eberron, now that it's a base class, one, I do also think that it will likely end up being published in the player's handbook as a base class, as like the 13th base class, which also, in my opinion, should lead to an update of the open gaming license, allowing folks to make third-party homebrew for the Artificer and sell it independently of Wizards of the Coast. Because right now, if you're wondering why you don't see people doing Kickstarters or selling subclasses for the Artificer, it's because they're legally not allowed to. The only way you're allowed to legally release subclasses for the Artificer is to put it on the DMs Guild. Leave the rest be. I see posts all the time asking for radical changes. No classes, no more ability scores, no spells, no Vancian casting. It goes on and on. A game trying to meet these big changes isn't D&D, and I fully agree with this. Such desires are fine. There are so many awesome RPGs out there, but D&D isn't D&D if you strip out everything that makes it D&D. Whatever changes you make to D&D, remember its core roots and embrace how successful 5th edition has been so far. Very little changing to make the game enjoyable and successful for another 10 years, as it has been for the past 8. Could not have said it better myself, right? The if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality, I would say, is very present in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. It's a good system. It's the most popular D&D has ever been. It's mainstream. People are making, and more and more people are subsisting off of just their Dungeons and Dragons related content. But to that point, right, D&D is D&D, and it is what it is. And this is stuff that I've brought up, like the whole Lord of the Rings RPG kind of becoming into 5th edition. There are RPGs that do things better than D&D. D&D is a great RPG for playing Dungeons and Dragons. But there are other systems if you want to try something else, right? If you want to deal with the insanity and the crazy madness and eldritch horror, play Call of Cthulhu, right? That's what it's there for. While you can try and back end some different mechanics and do different things within, like if you want to play, Stranger Things or Harry Potter, right? Kids on Brooms, Kids on Bikes, Tales from the Loop, all these things kind of exist, right? All the White Wolf RPGs. You want to play Power Rangers, don't play Power Rangers with a 5th edition rule set. Use the Power Rangers RPG, right? There are things for this. Don't try to make D&D something it's not by removing stuff from D&D, but at the same time recognize that there are other RPGs that may do what you want to do better or handle it more so. Like, again, playing Star Wars 5e exists, right? We know that. That's a thing. But there's all the Star Wars systems that you could use. Same thing with Marvel, right? You could try to make superheroes in this, but there's like 4 different Marvel RPGs. Pick one. So just kind of in conclusion, going to the top and looking over all of Mike's points, let's think about which ones I agree with and which ones I do realistically think will appear. Make based off of Ray's comment that I think you're going to be pleased. 5.5 fully 5e compatible. I think that one we will get executed on as close as we possibly can. I'm 100% in agreement that that should happen. I think we'll get that. Include easier encounter building. Considering one of the main books that will be reprinted is the Dungeon Master's Guide, this is Wizards of the Coast's chance to fix all of the issues with the DMG and provide actual tools for people to use stuff rather than like, I feel like there's some parts of the DMG that gets used and then a lot of it no one even looks at. And I think if you had a lot more tools to teach people how to do things, you'd be better off. Theater of the Mind guidelines for combat, 100% agree. That should be something included in the DMG, maybe even referenced in the player's handbook. To Mike's point, there are several shows on the Wizards of the Coast own channel that use Theater of the Mind, and there aren't great resources for it. Strengthen high CR monsters. While yes, I'd like that, I don't know if we're going to truly see that. It depends on if this revamp does anything to handle things from challenge rating and level 10 and up. And if the pre-written adventures that will come out post this release will have a focus on getting people from 1 to 20 or even like an adventure that goes from 10 to 20. Fix certain spells and abilities. I agree. I think some of these kind of remained in the way they are due to historic, and they are, they kind of live the way they are because of the way they were in previous editions. I will say I do agree that there could be some tweaking, there could be some adjustments and possibly combining of certain spells to do different things, right? I mean, they kind of did it with Enhance Ability, having like Cat's Grace and Bull Strength and all these being separate abilities. They were all separate spells in previous editions. They condensed them down into one and let you pick. We may see more things like that in the future. I don't know how many adjustments like to Banish and Polymorph are kind of, I guess, in my opinion, kind of the best they can be given the circumstances. I don't know. Include Tasha's upgrades. I think that's a no-brainer. That definitely will happen. We've kind of seen that with every subsequent race that has been released has offered the sort of customizability of ability scores and things. I think provide less problematic race descriptions. They've already kind of shown that they're doing that with the adjustments they made in Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse. So I think that will happen. Update the system resource document under the open gaming license. That's the only one that I very much want, and obviously Mike does as well, that I'm skeptical will actually end up happening. And then leave the rest be. I sincerely hope they do. We don't need drastic changes like this. We saw possibly removing a short rest, maybe not. We talked about bonus actions and how they wanted to get rid of them in the past. Also, again, to the point of it being fully backwards compatible with 5e, if you keep changing things like this, like do some drastic overhaul by removing a function of the game that was 5e compatible. Like, if you removed bonus actions or short rests or both in this new 5.5e, that really drastically changes the way anything from 5th edition works, right? How does your Warlock work in 5.5 if you had no short rests? How about all the cool things a rogue could do as a bonus action, and all of that's gone? So I don't know. I'm hoping they'll leave the rest be, but I don't know. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. Thank you again, and a shout out to my patrons over on Patreon for continuing to sponsor me and the channel. We'll see you all next time.